These people have been induced to brave every danger and difficulty during the late war, rather than render any service to the rebels. Their property is real and personal, taken to support their enemies, the fatherless and widows stripped, and every means of support taken from them, their houses and lands and all personal property taken, and no resting place could be found for them. As to place them in their former possessions is impossible. Stripped of all their property, robbed of a free and mild government, betrayed and deserted by their friends, what can repay them for the misery? Dragging out a wretched life of obscurity and want, heaven only, which smooths the rugged paths, can reconcile them to misfortune. So much for my prepared remarks. That was a gentleman by the name of David Fanning from North Carolina, an American who served as a colonel in the Loyalist North Carolina militia. This is going to be a presentation on the military, foremost. This is not a 101 entry into Loyalist studies. That's for another time. It's not even New Jersey centric or anything else. It is on the military. Why? Because it's what I study. I don't pretend to get into the politics of things or anything else. It is what I am fairly good at. So we're going to talk specifically about the Americans who fought for the British. And by the way, the title, The Good Americans, also not my words. Those are the words of a British general, General James Robertson, who was, by way of trivia, the last royal governor of New York. And he said that it was never his intention for the British to put down the rebellion, but to use the good Americans to put down the bad Americans. Okay, and if you're wondering who are the bad Americans, you can go around Trenton and take a look at statues of Washington and whatnot and figure out who he's referring to as the bad Americans. The British had a history of raising troops in America throughout colonial times. The British Army, despite what you may have read or heard somewhere, was not the biggest army of Europe at the start of the American Revolution, or for really any period in the 18th century. What is Great Britain at its core? An island, islands, all right? So do you need large standing armies to protect islands, or do you need ships? You need ships, all right? So the British relied upon their navy much more than their army. The result was at the start of the American Revolution, the British Army was only around 40,000 troops. That is to garrison England, Ireland, Scotland, and every colony in the British Empire. So that is not a big standing force. So for all its previous wars in the 18th century, the British also raised troops in America, right? Just looking at the French and Indian War, the bulk of the British Army in America was often troops raised in America. Now, that could either be the militia, who was everyone between the ages of 16 and 60, capable of bearing arms, or what they called provincials. Provincials are best described as American regulars, all right? For the rebellious side of things, that would be the Continental Army, all right? George Washington, Nathaniel Greene, Hugh Mercer, all those folks you read about in school, those are Continental officers commanding the Continental Army. Their equivalent for the British would be the provincial forces. So this would be the provincial establishment. And you have that lovely button that you see on your screen there, that RP. I'm from Bergen County. It does not stand for Ridgefield Park. It stands for Royal Provincial. So these regulars would supplement the British forces throughout the American Revolution. The first two provincial regiments were actually authorized to be raised before hostilities broke out at Lexington and Concord. So the British knew that something was going to happen. They knew that they needed more regiments, so they decided to raise troops in America and authorized two regiments to be raised in America before shots were even fired. And they were raised in every colony in America. So students of history here, there were only 13 colonies, right? No, 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 no. There were 13 rebellious colonies, but there were other colonies as well that did not rebel. Everything from Newfoundland to the province of West Florida, okay? Or if you want to take Nova Scotia to West Florida, that was referred to as America, right? Province of West Florida, province of East Florida, Nova Scotia, Quebec, of course, out to Detroit. So there's a lot of area out there that was well beyond the 13 colonies. Now, when we're talking about the military, we're talking about soldiers. Soldiers are organized into battalions and regiments. And at this time in history, for the British, a battalion and a regiment is often used interchangeably, and it could get confusing. You can have multiple battalions in one regiment, which was the case for both the British Army and the provincial forces, or you can simply refer to a regiment as a battalion. They knew what they were talking about. It could be difficult for the person today to understand that. But for our purposes, we'll discuss battalion. A battalion is authorized to be, was authorized to be, 500 enlisted men, approximately 34 officers, including staff, 30 sergeants, 30 corporals, 10 drummers, 500 privates, organized into 10 companies. And you can see this marvelous image of a camp in England, not America, of what a battalion looked like encamped, broken down by companies. And all those big circus-like looking tents along the periphery are not circus tents, those are officers' tents. As you can imagine, the smaller white tents are the ones for the enlisted men. And the sort of conical looking ones are for muskets. Muskets get their own tents. They're very lucky. The provincial forces would morph during the war. Some of them would become even more important or more worthy, probably a better word. The British wanted to recognize and reward certain regiments for meeting their recruiting goals, for their service in combat, all that sort of thing. So in 1779, they created the American Establishment. And to make things even more confusing, they named certain regiments as the American regiments. So if you see a document that says the 1st American Regiment or the 2nd American Regiment, they're not fighting for George Washington. They're fighting for King George. So the 1st American Regiment actually has a descendant regiment today in the Canadian Army. That would be the Queen's Rangers. We'll talk more about them. But they were re-raised after the American Revolution around 1790 in England for service in Canada. By the way, Canada in 18th century terminology refers only to the province of Quebec. Right? Modern Canada dates from 1867. So Canada is Quebec, all right, and that extends all the way out to Detroit. So that is what Canada is. Now, certain Loyalist regiments also went on to become regular British regiments. The Royal Highland Immigrants, for example, in 1778 became a regular British regiment, the 84th Regiment of Foot. Some of the regiments on the American Establishment became regular British regiments. Now, none of this really made much difference, except in how they ordered their clothing or their rank after the war. Certain little things like that, but not much else different. Matter of pride, perhaps. That gentleman on the screen there is probably one of the few people you've heard of that we're talking about. That's Banister Tarleton. Tarleton was not a loyalist per se, but he was a British officer in command of a regiment raised here in America called the British Legion, also known as the 5th American Regiment. So on Christmas Day, 1782, the cavalry of his unit, but not the infantry, was made a regular British regiment. So you have further establishments. Material culture, that's always a big thing with folks these days, particularly in museums and whatnot. Now, we're all familiar with, saying, oh, the redcoats are coming, the redcoats are coming. Well, provincial forces, some did indeed wear red, we'll discuss that in a minute, but their initial uniforms looked much like how my friend Chris there is dressed on the screen. green coats faced white. Now, why is that? People think, oh, because Americans were very clever and they were going to fight as rangers and hide behind trees and whatnot. So they were going to be in camouflage. That's why they got put in green. No, nothing nearly that sexy. When the British started raising these troops, they started getting a lot of recruits very quickly, more so than their supply train could handle. The British did not have excess uniforms just sitting around. So provincial soldiers were not a part of the British regular army. The British regular army consisted at the start of the war of 70 regiments of foot, plus the Royal Artillery and the cavalry units and whatnot. But anybody raised in America was technically not a British soldier. They were referred to as a supernumerary, an extraordinary expense, all right? Not part of the War Office, which paid for the British Army. So who paid for extraordinary expenses? The Treasury Office. So it was the Treasury Office that had to provide clothing for all these soldiers. So they went to their main contractor and said, we need clothing for 5,000 men as quickly as possible. And the contractor said, okay, I don't have 5,000 redcoats. Like, what do you have? He said, well, we have green, we have brown. Like, okay, your choice, pick it out. That's how 5,000 green uniforms arrived in early April of 1777 for the provincial forces. And it was simply because that was quickly on hand. The next year's clothing would be red. But then the year after, it would go back to green. And then the year after that, it would go back to red. So you need a scorecard to keep in track of all this. Whenever you see somebody showing like a Loyalist illustration, like an Osprey book or something, that's a snapshot of 1 year, all right? Unlike the British Army, the regular army, so you had the Coldstream Guards. The Coldstream Guards are going to be in the same uniform every year for their existence, all right? The tailoring, the style may change, but they're always going to be in a red coat faced blue. Their buttons are always going to be the same. For the provincial forces, that wasn't the case. These regiments were only to be raised for the duration of the war or 2 or 3 years, whichever came first. And they were all going to be disbanded after that. They didn't need to be in the same uniform every year. So it didn't matter what clothing they got. So that nice red coat there, that is actually was owned by an officer of the Prince of Wales American Regiment, a guy by the name of Munson Hoyt from Connecticut. And the gentleman on the right, the officer there, is the favorite son of Sussex County, New Jersey, Knowlton Township's James Moody, arguably the most famous Loyalist officer from New Jersey. So Moody's portrait was actually painted in England, either in 1782 or 83. So there are many different types of colors of clothing. And if you want to get it even more confusing, some of the clothing was also blue. All right. We've all seen portraits of George Washington and friends from the Continental Army being dressed in blue. Well, yeah, the Newfoundland Regiment, raised in, surprise, surprise, Newfoundland, was dressed in blue coats faced red. Several South Carolina regiments and one North Carolina one got some blue coats in 1780. Some folks serving in the Northern Army out of Quebec got some blue coats as well. So yeah, those are folks from the Newfoundland Regiment up there. That very stern looking person was probably the one who ordered that clothing. That would have been their commanding officer, Robert Pringle, an engineer known for his strict observance of military etiquette. Hence the poor soldier with the shovel doffing his hat and salutes as the stern looking Pringle marches on by. Now, how did an officer become an officer? And that gets to the crux of how you raise troops for these regiments. Now, keep in mind, the British Army, for the bulk of the war, only occupied certain coastal cities. America is much more than just a few coastal cities. It's great swaths of countryside that, for most of the war, was run by various forms of rebel governments, either locally or on the state level. and of course, all the way up to the Continental Congress. So it was difficult for loyalists in the areas where the British Army wasn't to raise troops, right? Folks would not, put on a button going, "Yay, King George," and go down to the local tavern and raise a glass to His Majesty. Although occasionally that did happen after a few previous ales, with unfortunate consequences to those people. But normally it was a person of influence in the neighborhood. You see there, Jonathan Williams, that's his commission up on the board. Commission is the legal document saying an officer is an officer. That means if you're under him, you have to obey him. Likewise, if he is under someone else, he has to obey those people. That's the legal document. Now, how do you get that commission now? With the provincial forces, it was by how many people you raised, how many people you recruited. This is sometimes the case on the continental side as well. So how do you do that? Well, it's generally the leading people of the neighborhood, all right? It's generally not the blacksmith, all right? It's somebody who is a landowner, who is a leading person in the neighborhood, who previous to the war, you've gone to the tavern with, and he's always told you crops to plant, and they've always worked out well. He's told you who to vote for in the provincial assembly, and those guys have been pretty good. So if he's saying, look, I think the British are going to win this. Oh, okay. You should. I'm raising a company to put down George Washington. You should enlist with me. Okay, so it sounds good. So it is often just as simple as that. They were generally people who were well known in the neighborhood, and there were certain numbers of people that each had to raise, whether it be 25 or 30 or 18 or 12, depending upon the rank. All right, captain, lieutenant, ensign. Those are the three officers of each company. Now, rank. We talk about rank. Well, how does that relate to the British Army? Now, our friend up on the screen there, not the king in the background, that gentleman is Anthony Allaire, a young officer from the Hudson Valley in the Loyal American Regiment. How does he rank compared to a regular British officer? Now, Allaire started the war as an ensign, all right, i.e. a second lieutenant, all right? So if the British officer on the right is also an ensign, who outranks whom? The British officer will outrank him. Now, when the war started, they utilized the provincial establishment from the previous war, the French and Indian War. So if, say, Allaire was a lieutenant and that British officer was an ensign, Allaire would still be outranked by the ensign. He would serve as the most junior officer of the inferior rank. So if you were a loyalist captain, a provincial captain, a British regular lieutenant would still outrank you. That changed in 1779 by the king himself. He wanted to reward His Majesty's faithful subjects for their service by abolishing that system and going strictly by dates of commission. Now, a provincial lieutenant, and that's how Allaire ended up the war as a lieutenant, would only be outranked by a British lieutenant. A British ensign would not outrank him. That caused a lot of consternation in the British Army, because these were professional soldiers who had purchased commissions for the most part and had served for 10, 20 or more years. Now, all of a sudden, Bob over here, raises 30 guys and he's a captain. He served for the last 9 months. How is he outranking me, a British lieutenant who served, His Majesty faithfully for the last 12 years? Well, the British in America did complain about that. And the king said, mind your own business. I'm the king, I'm doing what I want. So that was a changer for the Americans in British service. Now, as we alluded before, not everybody serving in a Loyalist regiment was an American, all right? There were a number of regular British officers from the United Kingdom, the British Isles, serving in America. That gentleman there on the screen is Patrick Ferguson. He raised a corps to serve in the South known as the American Volunteers, drawn from existing Loyalist regiments served at New York, who wanted to take part in the siege of Charleston. So he was, Ferguson, of course, was the very famous person who invented a breech loading rifle that could fit a bayonet. He was only a captain, and is shown there in his 70th Regiment of Foot captain's uniform. But he was one of these people who was young and very energetic, and is what the British were looking for as far as people to experienced people to lead Loyalist troops. George Hanger, Major of the British Legion. Hanger was an officer of the Guards, also in the Hessian service. He served under Banister Tarleton in the British Legion. My own personal friend here, Francis Lord Rawdon, a young Irishman. Most of these folks are in their 20s, by the way. Young Irishman who would raise the Volunteers of Ireland as their colonel. John Graves Simcoe. Anybody here watch the show Turn? Okay, you may not recognize Simcoe if you watch Turn because he's not actually dripping blood. Simcoe was actually nothing like what he was portrayed in the series Turn. He was actually a pretty nice guy. He's shown here around circa 1790 in the later uniform of the Queen's Rangers when he became Lieutenant Governor of the province of Upper Canada, which you know better today as Ontario. They're up in, they had a holiday up there in Ontario, Simcoe Day. Their view of Simcoe was not anything like that of the show Turn. So interesting in that respect. And there, of course, Banister Tarleton, so famous, he got a picture made from him. But these were all regular British Army officers from the British Isles who commanded regular troops because they're young, they're go-getters, but the way the British system is structured, they can't advance very high within their own regiments. People advance through basically vacancies. So you're basically hoping somebody gets poor and has to sell out or they die. So either way, it's not conducive to making friends in your regiment. You hope they live. So how does a young, aggressive officer get advanced? He went into the provincial forces. Hessians, right? This is Trenton. We know the history of Hessians in America, if for nowhere else, in Trenton, where the Brigade of Rahl was surprised by George Washington and friends in 1776. Now, in addition to some British serving in provincial regiments, some Hessians, some Germans also served in provincial regiments, including a troop of hussars. And this is not exactly how they looked. This is a French and the 7 Years' War German hussar unit. Hussar is a light cavalry. But they were raised in New York from escapees from the Burgoyne campaign, from Brunswickers primarily. Now, the Brunswick troops that remained serving in America were up in Quebec, which we know is Canada. But for the guys in New York, they didn't know what to do with them. So they mounted them as a troop of cavalry. Well, you can't raise a new Hessian unit in New York City. So what did they do? They put them on the provincial establishment. So you get a unit that is virtually entirely German on the Loyalist provincial establishment. Also, several Hessian officers, again, looking to advance themselves, sold out of their Hessian regiments or resigned from their Hessian regiments and joined provincial forces to get higher rank. Now, one of the things they did to encourage enlistment in provincial forces was to raise what they call national corps. We mentioned our friend Lord Rawdon before. That soldier with the funky looking coat and cap is from the Volunteers of Ireland. The Volunteers of Ireland was raised in 1778 by Lord Rawdon under the hope of drawing away the Irish from Washington's army. knowing that a good part of Washington's troops were Irish. How'd they know that? Because they interviewed the prisoners that they would take after each battle and find out where most of them came from. And often they would say Ireland. So they knew a good proportion of Washington's troops were from Ireland. So they decided, okay, raise a regiment of Irish, which they did. And they drew away, by Rawdon's estimate, about 400 men initially to raise this corps. Rawdon joked with his father back in Ireland that in 1779, that he didn't think there was not a soldier in the regiment that had not shot at their colonel at one time or another. So love Rawdon's sense of humor. Now, the soldier in the kilt there, the plaid, is a member of the Royal Highland Immigrants. That was one of those two regiments I alluded to at the start here that was authorized to be raised before the war even broke out. They were a 2-battalion corps, one serving in the Northern Army out of Quebec, one in the Army in America. And that, of course, was to induce Scottish to enlist. A lot of Highland soldiers had settled in North America after the end of the French and Indian War, either in Quebec or scattered throughout America, including New Jersey. And they figured, okay, there's a national attachment there, so put them in their native dress, and well, it worked. This is the unit that became the 84th Regiment of Foot in 1778. So, and of course, Tarleton in the back there, raising his unit known as the British Legion. So obviously with a nod to Old England. Now, where did one find recruits? All right. Now that is a British recruiting party in England. Right? No one went around like that here in America. And those are some sad-looking recruits, as they are. But in America, it was mostly clandestinely. In the cities the British occupied, you could take out advertisements in the newspapers looking for people, and they did. But most private soldiers were common laborers or whatnot, not the sort of folks with a newspaper subscription. So there's not many folks reading the what would amount to the want ads in the paper and saying, oh, this regiment's raising here, I'll go enlist with them. But they would sneak into the countryside clandestinely to raise troops. So it was not, again, the sort of thing where you're putting on a pin saying, yay, King George. But it was more akin to, you want to join the army? So, and you hold out bounties, right? Whereas a lot of these regiments were called volunteers. In this provincial establishment, it was all volunteer. No one's drafted. So you're all volunteer, but you're not doing it for the goodness of your heart. There's also pay involved. And when you enlist in the army, as with the regular British Army, you got a bounty. So oftentimes regiments would offer an additional bounty. The King's bounty was 3 shillings, right? So, excuse me, 3 pounds, 3 guineas, which would be 60 or 63 shillings. So, which is good money, but which is going to be deducted from it, the cost of your uniform. So, but it's still good money. So some of these regiments took to pooling their money from the officers to raise additional bounty money to get additional recruits. Now, not everybody in a provincial regiment was a loyalist from the start. Some of them weren't even loyalists at the end or even when they enlisted. A lot of provincials, particularly as the war went on, had started the war in the Continental Army. All right. Think of them today as your undecided voter. All right. They could go one way, but they could just as easily go the next. And they may change their mind for the next election. So the grass is always greener on the other side. We've all heard the great resignation since the plague set in. All these people who quit their jobs, went on to a better job, and now want to go back to their old job because the new job really wasn't what they thought it would be, whatever. Well, a lot of folks switched sides. This is a concept that I've found very difficult for people to accept today. That, we grew up in a time when people don't generally do that in the military. I mean, could you conceive of waking up one day, 10, 15 years ago, looking open the New York Times and saying, oh, the Taliban have just fielded 600 men from the 82nd Airborne who all deserted. Inconceivable, but not then. So if you look up on the screen there, that's actually where the arrow is pointing for a guy named Isaac Allaby. I use him because I've actually been in touch with his descendant over the years. He started the war in the 2nd New Jersey Continental Regiment, right? He deserted there from that regiment on May 25th, 1778. And less than 2 weeks later, he's enlisting in the Loyalist 3rd Battalion, New Jersey Volunteers. So these folks could switch sides. And they knew that. There was a whole provincial regiment raised in 1778 by a guy named Rodolphus Ritzema. Ritzema had been a field officer in the New York line at the beginning of the war. He took part in the invasion of Canada, the whole 9 yards. Well, in 1777, he's making a pitch to raise a regiment for the British in New York City. And he did in 1778 with the appellation Royal American Reformees. I've always pictured that unit in sort of like orange jumpsuits on the side of the road picking up trash, but I'm sure it was a much more prestigious uniform. But it was not unknown at the time. Artillery. Most of the troops raised for the British, particularly in the provincials, were infantry troops. The Royal Artillery was sort of a separate beast of the British Army, according to the Board of Ordnance. Sir William Howe, the British commander in 1777, was acutely aware that there were not enough artillerymen in America. So he asked for permission to raise an American artillery regiment on the provincial establishment. And the Board of Ordnance said, no, the artillery is purely British. So Howe said, okay, and simply attached the entire 2nd Battalion, New Jersey Volunteers, to the Royal Artillery for the next 2.5 years to flesh out their ranks and give them more artillerymen. In addition to that, regular British soldiers and other provincials were attached as needed. They were known as additionals. New York City also raised its own artillery company for the New York Marine Society, which I believe is still around today. Prisoners, okay. So you're fighting one of these provincial regiments and you get captured. Okay, I surrender. All right, for you, is the war over? For you, are you going to get the Geneva Convention? Well, there is no Geneva Convention, so forget that. Normally, if you're taken prisoner around here, you might end up at that place on the screen, which is the new jail in Philadelphia. And you were eligible for exchange, right? Just because you were taken prisoner didn't mean the war was over. So if our friend imaginary Bob over there was taken prisoner, Bob would be exchanged for Paul, serving in a Continental Regiment based on his rank. Private for private, corporal for corporal, sergeant for sergeant, officer for officer based on rank. And to make things more fun, they also came up with an exchange rate. Say you had a captain, but you had no captain to exchange, but you had a bunch of privates. Well, a captain is equal to so many privates. So they created these cartels. Now, also, if you're a prisoner, doesn't mean you have to sit in the new jail the whole time. You could be let out to work and earn money because there's labor shortages. So if they let you out, if you're a shoemaker, you go help make shoes with somebody in town. You report back at the end of the night to the new jail. So there are things you could do. Of course, some people took the opportunity to escape. Also, people took the opportunity to enlist in the enemy army. So Continental Army soldiers taken prisoner by the British could enlist with the British, and same vice versa. Now, we mentioned each battalion was 10 companies. Some of those companies are special. All companies are created equal. Some are just more equal than others. The soldier on the right there, that is what's known as a grenadier. And specifically, he's a grenadier in the Queen's Rangers, the 1st American Regiment. You can see his tall bearskin cap. Grenadiers were supposed to be the tallest men, the bravest men. If you want your real elite of the army, those are the guys. That coat on the left and the waistcoat and the breeches, those belong to a light infantry officer. One company of grenadiers and one of light infantry in each regiment. And that is the uniform of Jeremiah French, who was the light infantry officer, one of them, of the King's Royal Regiment of New York. So one of the few provincial uniforms still in existence. Light infantry were generally supposed to be smaller soldiers, agile soldiers, troops who could run, fight in skirmish order. Those are the guys hiding behind trees and whatnot and stone walls, and really doing a lot of the light sort of small war that prevailed in America. So much so that the British raised an entire battalion of provincial light infantry drawn from 6 provincial regiments at New York, and put that grainy image guy in the slide there, an officer of the British Guards, John Watson Tadswell Watson, another one of these 20-somethings who would command a provincial unit. Riflemen, all right, we've all seen all the images of the sleuthy American riflemen hiding behind trees, picking off stupid people wearing red, who are too dumb to take cover or anything else. Well, at any given time, the British had as many or more riflemen than the Continental Army had. And some of them, primarily Germans of the Jaeger Corps, some were regular British under Patrick Ferguson, and others were Loyalists, such as that image there of, again, a Queen's Ranger. That is a Queen's Ranger's rifleman. At one time, there were as many as 36 Queen's Rangers riflemen armed with a rifle. Now, why wasn't, well, number one, what is a rifle as compared to a musket? What's everybody else carrying? They're carrying muskets, smoothbore weapons. What makes a rifle a rifle? Grooves in the barrel. Grooves in the barrel make the musket bullet spin. A spinning ball goes further, straighter. Okay, well, why were they so stupid as to not arm everyone with a rifle? Rifle takes significantly more time to load, fouls much more easily, and also, for the most part, cannot fit a bayonet. Whereas you could load and fire a musket 3 to 4 times a minute and attach a bayonet to it. One British officer noted after the Battle of Long Island, the riflemen we were opposed to thought they had the best of us until we had them pinned to the trees with our bayonets. So by the time it took to load a rifle is the time somebody you were firing at could get up on you. So rifles were very useful when used in conjunction with people armed with bayonets. Cavalry. The British fought the American Revolution, for the most part, with 1 regiment of cavalry in America. From 1776 to 78, there were 2, but after that, just 1, the 17th Light Dragoons. They needed to raise cavalry in America, and lots of them. So units like the Queen's Rangers would eventually have 5 troops of cavalry. The British Legion would have 6 troops of cavalry. And our friend on the screen there, that's Benjamin Thompson of New England, another 20-something. But this guy was a New Englander, and he would raise in 1781 the regiment known as the King's American Dragoons, raised at New York. Their colors, their standard, which you can see in the background there, still exists today in the New Brunswick Museum. That is not up Route 1, that is in the province of New Brunswick, Canada, where the regiment settled in 1783. The color was presented to the regiment by none other than Prince William Henry in 1782 in Queens, New York. And also, in addition to the colors being at the New Brunswick Museum, the sermon that was preached by the regiment's chaplain on the presenting of the colors still exists there as well. So the British really, really needed to rely on cavalry raised in America. Music. The part of every battalion are so many drummers, In the case of Highland regiments, bagpipers, also fifers, as well as bands of music, which are a real different sort of thing. But every company had at least one drummer. All right, is that just for fun? Is that just for music? No, the drums and the fifes regulate the soldier's day. Tell the soldier when to get up in the morning, when to go to sleep at night, when to go get wood, when to go eat, when to march, when to stop marching, when to fire, cease firing, all that sort of stuff was regulated by fife and drum. So that's why every company needed music. That drum also exists in the New Brunswick Museum and was owned by a member of the 2nd Battalion, New Jersey Volunteers. I examined this original drum. It has been restrung over the years. What you're looking at is not the head of the drum, it's the bottom of the drum. So whoever took it apart, put it back together that way. But that is the actual bottom of the drum. And that thing on the left there, that is a pipe banner that would go on the bagpipe of the Royal Highland Immigrants. That too is an original. Secret Service. No, those aren't guys in capes protecting the king or Washington. The Secret Service is how the British referred to intelligence gathering. And they used loyalists to a great extent to gather intelligence. Some of these were regular provincial soldiers, others were civilians, others were women. The British relied upon Americans for virtually all their intelligence gathering. That person on the left there, anyone recognize him? That is Cortlandt Skinner. That was the former Speaker of the Assembly and Attorney General of New Jersey. He would raise the largest provincial regiment in the American Revolution, the New Jersey Volunteers, but he was also responsible for a lot of the Secret Service, particularly everything coming from the west side of the Hudson River, New Jersey, the Hudson Valley, Pennsylvania, that sort of thing. So I mentioned the British utilized women as well, and at least two concurrently operating in Westchester County, New York. And we know one of them was a school teacher from Philadelphia by the name of Ann Bates, who they need a miniseries about this woman. Her exploits were really phenomenal in gathering intelligence on Washington's army in the fall of 1778. Very brave person. But for spies, the British had no shortage. Now, obviously, when the British started recruiting troops, both black and white loyalists were enlisting into these provincial regiments. However, the British Army was a white organization, not a black organization, not an integrated organization. So in March of 1777, the new Inspector General of Provincial Forces, a guy by the name of Alexander Innes, someone who did not was not beloved by many provincial officers, wrote to General Howe and said, there are a number of blacks who have enlisted in the provincial forces, as well as others. And he enumerated them as mulattoes, Indians, and sailors as improper people to be enlisted. They wanted the provincial forces to look like the British forces. So House wrote back saying, no, they are not to be enlisted, and any who are to be discharged. Now, does that mean black loyalists did not serve under the British? Yes, they did in other ways. There was an entire provincial unit called the Black Pioneers, and that painting there, modern, obviously, but not a bad depiction of what a black pioneer would have looked like. Unarmed, right? Their duties, pioneer, sort of a catch-all duty rank of someone who does physical labor with the army. The regular British Army had one pioneer per company. Provincial units, same thing, but they raised an entire unit off the coast of North Carolina in April of 1776 called the Black Pioneers. And they served throughout the war. Other Black Pioneer units were raised down south. Many blacks served in what they call the civil branches. Civil branches in the Army, for those who've been in the military in modern times, are functions normally done by Reserve or National Guard forces today. Support logistical services involving food, shelter, wood, fuel, that sort of thing. Thousands served in that, or they could serve in the Royal Navy. In the provincial forces, also they could serve as musicians, drummers, fifers, trumpeters. Now that is a depiction, a 1780s depiction of a black woodcutter in Nova Scotia. The civil branches, Commissary General's Department, Quartermaster General's Department, Engineers Department, Barrack Master General's Department, they would employ thousands of black and white loyalists, people who may not want to serve or could not serve in a regular infantry or cavalry regiment. Better paid, by the way. All right, a soldier's pay, regular soldier, private, made 6 pence a day, from which was deducted 2.5 pence for his food. So you were not getting rich by any stretch of the imagination in the army. But the civil branches, people who could saw wood, people who could cart wood, things like that, build a hut, in great demand. So actually earned a lot more money, be they black or white, than a regular enlisted man in the provincial or British Army. The Royal Artillery also had its own civil branches, separate and distinct from the main army. And that on the left there is a deserter notice of blacks who had deserted from the Royal Artillery's civil branch, known as the Virginia Company of Blacks. So again, serving in many interesting ways. A whole different sort of function happened during the Burgoyne campaign. If you folks are familiar with that, 1777, when Howe went off to take Philadelphia, General John Burgoyne came down with an army from Quebec to capture Albany and sort of split the colonies in that faction. He raised a little over 4 regiments of troops along the way. These troops were all supposed to be part provincial. They raised their men as they went. Did Burgoyne bring arms for them, uniforms, all this sort of great stuff? No. The most arrogant British officer you can imagine brought along nothing for them. So the illustration on the right there is one of these soldiers in either the Queen's Loyal Rangers or the King's Loyal Americans, one of the two. Between the two of them, they shared 34 coats of red-faced green. So out of units that raised hundreds of men. That on the left is actually a period illustration of a French habitant. But Burgoyne did bring along clothing for the French militiamen, the Canadian militiamen who were on the expedition to build roads and whatnot, and ended up giving some of their clothing to some of these royalist troops, which were all manhandled during the campaign. They raised about 1,200 men. Only about 400 ever made it back to Canada. So they existed in this sort of netherworld. The British commander in Canada at the time, Sir Guy Tarleton, wasn't going to commission them in the provincial forces because they didn't recruit enough men. They said, well, we did. They're dead or prisoners now. It's like, oh, I didn't see them, so sorry. Then went back to England. And his replacement, General Haldeman, left him in limbo till eventually forming them as a provincial unit in November of 1781. Over 4 years of limbo. The Canadians themselves also served during the Burgoyne campaign. We mentioned some in the militia who worked en corvée, building roads and whatnot. Well, when the war broke out, the British thought that they'd raise more men in Canada than they would in America. They sent over clothing that they got from somewhere, somehow, again, more green, to Canada for clothing for 6,000 men. They raised 3 companies, all right, each of about 100 men. So some of the clothing was given to other provincial units raised in America. Some was given to the Quebec militia. That's basically what it looked like, a green coat faced red. Those 3 Canadian companies only served during the Burgoyne campaign, then disbanded. Now, there are many other things than provincials. Governors, right? When the war broke out, and for those provinces where governors still reigned, like East Florida, West Florida, Nova Scotia, those governors raised their own corps above militia. Right on the left there, we see a proclamation from Virginia's governor, Lord Dunmore, offering, asking people to come and join him, both black and white. He would raise 2 regiments and a troop of cavalry in Virginia. One regiment was white, the Queen's own Loyal Virginia Regiment. The other regiment was black, the Ethiopian Regiment. It really did not have any bearing on where they came from. It just sounded, I guess in Dunmore's view, they would draw more. So the Ethiopian Regiment, the Queen's own Loyal Virginians, are examples of local corps. Dunmore only had authority in Virginia. So when Virginia was evacuated in 1776, these guys went to Staten Island to join the British Army and were disbanded. All right. In East Florida in 1776, corps was raised by their governor, Patrick Toynan, the East Florida Rangers. They served until June 24th, 1779. And based on what you see on there on the screen, they were disbanded. But they were completely reorganized and started life as a provincial unit the very next day as the King's Carolina Rangers. Again, you really need a scorecard. Some corps were only raised for short periods of time. Right? The gentleman on the right there is William Axtell. Axtell basically served as the colonel of the Kings County Militia, Brooklyn Militia in New York. But he attempted to raise a corps in 1779 called the Nassau Blues, sort of an archaic name for Long Island. Was Nassau. In fact, go to Long Island today, there's Nassau County, which did not exist at the time of the American Revolution. But they decided to raise a Nassau Blues, which would exist for 6 months in 1779. Instead of 500 men, he raised 60, who basically guarded his house. Except for about 8 of them who went off with Patrick Ferguson as riflemen in the American Volunteers. And that's an image of one of Ferguson's riflemen from 1777. Refugees and partisans. Partisan is an 18th century term. Now, not the provincial establishment was fine, but the British were going to utilize you as they would regular British soldiers, particularly in garrison. Garrison life got boring. Now, if you had been abused by your rebel neighbors, all right, Fred there, took away my chickens and my cows, and he said nasty things to the local committee of observation and treasonous stuff, and I don't like him, so I want to really take out my revenge on him. Well, if you're a provincial soldier, you're following the orders of the army. They're not going to let you go off and just go after Fred. So that didn't appeal to everyone, and particularly the pay part as well. So others raised corps that were not provincial. Look at the names of refugees for the most part. Loyal Refugee Volunteers are my favorite. They were raised as a woodcutting corps at New York in the spring of 1780. For you Star Trek aficionados, they're who I like to refer to as the Ferengi of the American Revolution. Their interest was profit for the most part, in drawing lucrative contracts with the British Barrack Master General's Department to cut firewood. So, but they did a lot of things to supplement that, such as raiding their rebel neighbors. The British did not provide them with uniforms, muskets, provisions, or anything else. They were a total freelance operation. The Associated Loyalists. Anybody recognize that person on there? Anybody see the recent Ken Burns show on Benjamin Franklin? Well, that's his son, William Franklin there. William Franklin was sort of one of the leading political loyalists of the war. Of course, he was the royal governor of New Jersey, okay? And he was arrested at Perth Amboy. You can go see where he was arrested, still in Perth Amboy. And sent as a prisoner to Connecticut. His wife was sent into New York City, where she became ill, and Franklin asked George Washington and asked the state of New Jersey and asked his father, my wife is ill, please send me to New York on parole so I can take care of her. And everyone said no. Washington was the most gracious. He said, it's not up to me. I have nothing to do with why you were a prisoner, which was true. He was arrested by the state of New Jersey. Washington had no authority in that sort of civil thing. And of course, Franklin's wife died while he was a prisoner. He never saw her again. That embittered him very much. So when he came back, when he was exchanged in November of 78, he politically organized a number of leading loyalists into what was known as the Board of Associated Loyalists, which raised its own military, separate and distinct from the British military, so much so that they got their own royal charter from the king in 1780. This unit had its own infantry, cavalry, ships, and whatnot. They really only operated out of two places. One was Lloyd's Neck on Long Island, north of Huntington, and Sandy Hook. Sandy Hook was occupied by the British for the entire war. And some of these guys operated out of there. These were the folks who hanged Joshua Huddy on the Jersey Shore in 1782. So that this was some of them. Militia. Everyone's seen the embattled farmers on Lexington Green. They've seen the Minuteman statue up in Concord, standing up against the British. Well, it was the militia. As we said earlier, everyone between 16 and 60, capable of bearing arms. Now, very small areas of America were actually under British control, but where they did, they raised militia troops as well for the same sort of service that Patriot militia was raised for, which more often than not was just guard duty, particularly around New York. In the South, it was quite different. The Loyalist Southern militia and the Patriot Southern militia went at it to a degree that shocked both sides. They hated each other. They killed each other without any sort of regret. All right, Fred would not have survived as a militiaman down in South Carolina on either side. So that gentleman that you see there, his portrait is a recent acquisition from the Society of the Cincinnati in Washington, D.C. That's Colonel James Delancey, who commanded the Westchester County militia for the British. And of course, there was a Westchester County militia for the Patriot side, one from southern Westchester, one from northern Westchester. Did it get confusing? You betcha. So they were generally not uniformed either, though the militia officers could be. We're not going to get into, for the most part, Native Americans. I'm not an expert on it. I'm not going to embarrass myself. However, natives served on both sides of the war, primarily, however, with the British. If you go to the Museum of the American Revolution, you'll see a very nice exhibit on the Oneida tribe. And there were others that served with Washington, but primarily they served with the British. Now, certain officers were Americans serving with the Native allies. They wanted people who could act as officers, interpreters, rangers, and staff people, even such as blacksmiths and surgeons to support them. The gentleman on the right there, strikingly handsome in the 18th century, that is a Maryland provincial officer from the Regiment of Maryland Loyalists, William Augustus Bowles. He served with the Creeks and the Cherokees down in West Florida. So amazing individual. But wherever there were parties of Native troops, there were generally white officers or white rangers along with them. The British did not want complete wanton destruction with Native warfare. They did not want the deaths of women and children. It happened, but they tried to stop it by putting these sort of advisors in with them. Loyalists also served on the seas. We know that there was not any great continental navy, John Paul Jones notwithstanding, during the American Revolution. Most of the service for the Patriots was done by privateers, or merchant ships. Well, Loyalists also had privateers. What is a privateer? Privateer is a privately owned ship of war. All right. We'll have another imaginary friend, Stan, over here. Stan is a merchant in New York City. He can outfit a ship, say a brig or a sloop or a schooner, fit it with cannon, enlist a crew to serve on board. That he's going to get what they call a letter of marque and retaliation from the governor. If he was in New York in 1778 or 9, that'd be William Tryon. That says Stan is allowed to go and wage war on ships from the United States or France or Spain or Holland, depending on the year. And when they capture that ship, they bring it into New York. That ship is then auctioned off along with all of its stores. Now, they're not going to go after warships. No profit in attacking warships. They're going to go after unarmed merchant ships that are carrying any manner of stuff: flour, wood, tar, tobacco, you name it. And that stuff is all sold at auction in New York City. Now, they take all the proceeds from that, the vendue master, and he then divides it by shares. The owner gets, obviously, the greatest amount. It's his investment. Then the captain gets so many, down to the cook on board the ship. Depending on your rank, you get more shares. But that is a great way to get rich, provided you didn't get captured. So then if you got captured, then, well, that would be unfortunate. So, but thousands of Loyalists, both black and white, served on board privateers or in the Royal Navy itself. With these soldiers, right, came their families, right? So those troops that are, say, on the march toward the Battle of Monmouth or on the march toward the Battle of Brandywine, their families are often with them, right? Both, whether they be British soldiers, provincial soldiers, continental soldiers, it was all the same. They all had a certain amount of women and children along with them. Those women and children were not taking part in the battles. They were in camp along the line of march with the wagons. They were there to serve as nurses, serve as laundresses, or in any other respect as the army would need them. They were supposed to be proportionate. British were very strict on the proportion of women in the regular regiments. So many can only be sent over from England. And these are the soldiers' wives, right? They're not their girlfriends, they're not the concubines. These are the soldiers' wives and children. Now, with the provincial forces, one of the ways that the states financed the war was the confiscation of Loyalist estates, right? If you owned a house and you were a Loyalist, boom, the state declares you, they have a trial, of course, it's very fair, and confiscate your house and your property, everything in your house, and they sell it at auction to your neighbors, whether you're there or not, and usually you were not. Well, if your family was there, though, say you had gone off to join the army and you left behind your wife and 3 kids, well, then the state comes knocking at the door and saying, hi, your husband's a Loyalist, it's the 18th century, leave. So where are they going to go? They're going to go join their husbands. So at any time, there are as many women and children in a provincial unit as there are men. So it was a great strain on provisions for the British, but they had no choice in the matter. They had to take care of them. Now, the war is over. British soldiers here can go home. Look at that happy British soldier. He's got a gentleman there saying, hi, this is my daughter. Thank you, take her. And they're going to have a very nice life afterwards. But they could go home. But what of the Loyalists? All right. The war has been very tough on the Americans who have fought for the British. So tough that they were even forced to apparently ride headless horses. But that's conjecture on my part. But that is actually an original image from 1781. The artist never got to finish painting it. But what is going to happen to these loyalists who fought for the British? In 1783, the main British post at New York was going to be evacuated, right? That's where the British have been headquartered for most of the war since it was captured in 1776. And the British were actually surprised, literally surprised, that so many Americans would want to leave with them. Well, it's your country. Why don't you just stay here? Well, they had just been kicked out of their homes and expended all their blood, sweat, and tears for the support of King George and the British government. And number one, doesn't rank highly with your neighbors who were not of the same political persuasion. If the state had confiscated your house, you have no place to go home to. So why would they think they were going to stay here? Well, they did, and tens and tens and tens of thousands of them, black and white, left America for either Canada, Nova Scotia, Jamaica, the West Indies. A few went to England. So just tens of thousands, probably 80 to 100,000 men, women, and children. So it was the greatest exodus of Americans ever in history. So now, if they're going up to these new places, what's going to become of them? Well, the provincial corps, number one, are going to be disbanded. As we mentioned, these soldiers, these regiments were only raised for the war. Well, the war is now over. So what's going to happen? They're going to get discharges. There's an original discharge up on the screen. You're going to get 2 weeks severance pay. Oh boy. But what the British are also going to do is provide free grants of land, clothing, and provisions. Now, the land grant thing is the most important. When you enlisted in a provincial regiment, you were promised, depending on who made the promise, 50 or 100 acres of land. That's a big deal. If you're a common soldier, you're a laborer, you're not a landowner for the most part, right? You're working for someone else. You don't own land. And in the 18th century, being a landowner is an important thing. You get voting rights and all other benefits accruing there too. So if you're holding out the opportunity for someone to be a landowner, that's a big deal. So the British were planning on giving that land in New York or New Jersey or Pennsylvania. And surprise, surprise, in 1783, they were no longer able to follow through on that promise. So where else were they going to go? To wherever the British still owned land in North America, Quebec, Nova Scotia for the most part. And Nova Scotia was pretty quickly divided into two, Nova Scotia and New Brunswick. So that is where, for the most part, these folks left. That is an actual image of the disbanded 2nd Battalion, King's Royal Regiment of New York in New Johnstown along the St. Lawrence River. That regiment had served out of Quebec during the war, and that's how they appeared right after their disbandment. The soldiers, the former soldiers, are still in their clothing, their uniforms. That's the only clothing they had. Now, here's an interesting point. Most of these provincial regiments who left New York City left in September of 1783. They arrived in the Bay of Fundy, what is now the city of St. John, which was wilderness, later in September, the beginning of October of 1783. You folks ever see any tourism commercials for Nova Scotia for the winter? I'm willing to bet no, right? There's a reason for that. It's not enjoyable up there in the winter. So particularly those who went to New Brunswick, and that was the bulk of them, there was nothing. So it's one thing to say you're going to grant people land, right? Fine. You get 100 acres of land. Okay, you step off the boat. Where is it? Oh, what do you have to do before you give out land first? Survey it. Get that man a bottle of water. So you have to survey it because none of it's surveyed. It's all wilderness. So if you're going to give out all these acres of land without going insane, you have to survey it first. The surveys took 2 to 3 years. So that first winter up there, see those tents in the illustration? That's what they slept in, tents. Those are simple canvas. There's no floors to them. Trust me, I've slept in them. There's no floors on them. So there's a couple of really cool journals talking about this and how they had to build chimneys in them and how to keep the young kids awake to sweep away the snow from burying the tents in the middle of the night. So very tough. They would give away land, basically drawing it by lot. Those are original, what they call chits for land. They put a number, they put somebody's a number, and somebody would come and pick a number out of the hat and say, okay, you're getting lot 56 or you're getting lot 73. Because not all of the land was the same. Some of it's rocky, some of it's fertile. There's creeks in some, not creeks in others. Some of it is cleared, mostly it's woods. So how do you fairly distribute that? By random lottery drawing. And that is basically where most of these provincial regiments were disbanded along the River St. John. So from Fredericton in the north down to St. John on the Bay of Fundy. Some of the officers who had served would get half pay for life. That gentleman there is John Saunders, a Queen's Ranger officer, an original officer of the Queen's Own Loyal Virginia Regiment under Dunmore. They would get half pay depending on their rank for the rest of their lives. Some of these soldiers would get a Chelsea pension. What is that? Chelsea is the British Army Hospital in London, and some provincials who had been injured, wounded in battle, were eligible to receive what they call an out pension, a small stipend each year for their service. In 1837, the province of New Brunswick created an old soldier pension. Keep in mind, the first U.S. pension was established in, anybody? 1818, right, for destitute Continental Army soldiers. Then amended again in 1820, then in 1832 for militia, then later on for widows. Well, province of New Brunswick finally caught on in 1837. Queen Victoria was already in power. And they decided whoever was still alive could get a pension. So whether they be Loyalist or British or Hessian or whatnot, that is actually a New Jersey volunteer officer in the 1820s there, Justice Earl, Bergen County. Loyalists would be eligible to submit claims for losses, right, based on their confiscated property or services rendered that they were not paid for, or loss of profession. Say if you were an attorney in New York City, or actually better, Trenton, and you were not able to be a Loyalist Trenton lawyer, you could put in for the loss of salary. Now, where was the drawback there? You needed proof, okay? Fred just can't go to the British. Yeah, I had this really great house and I was an important lawyer and I lost tons of money. Okay, prove it. Well, if Fred had gone off to join the army, again, for those folks who've gone off to join the military in their life, do you bring the deed to your house with you? Do you bring your dad's will with you? All that other stuff that proves what you own? No, you don't do that. Well, they didn't do it back then either. So a lot of the claims were rejected out of hand for want of proof. But the British still ended up paying huge sums of money. Now, if you want to research more of this stuff today, well, primarily that's a muster roll on there. That lists all the soldiers in one company of one battalion, and those were taken pretty much every 61 days. So there are thousands of Loyalist muster rolls, primarily in the Library and Archives Canada in Ottawa. But there are some down the street in the New Jersey State Archives. All right. And it would be wonderful for the 250th if the State Archives took out some of its Loyalist material, which is really substantial. A number of muster rolls and whatnot for exhibit again. But a lot of these records could also be found online. And gosh darn it, there's this pretty cool website called royalprovincial.com that has a lot of transcriptions on it, about 1,600 original documents on there. that you can find that on. Now, who was Trenton's leading loyalist? It's a subjective question. There's no one right question, or one right answer. It was not this guy. It was this guy's son. Well, this guy is actually Isaac Allen Jr. Isaac Allen is arguably, and in my opinion, and it's my lecture, so I can state my opinion, Isaac Allen Sr. was Trenton's leading loyalist. He raised the 6th Battalion, New Jersey Volunteers in Hunterdon County. And as I know you know, this was Hunterdon County during the war. Isaac Allen was indeed a lawyer from Trenton. So that is an image of his son, Isaac Allen Jr. How do you know it's his son? Because of that funky 19th century uniform he's wearing. And that hairdo, all right? So anything you see with a big standing collar like that is generally 19th century. So certainly not the mark of the Revolutionary War. So with that, are there any questions?
You mentioned the war in the South was more vicious. I've heard that other times. Do you know what the cause of that was?
That's an excellent question. Well, if you want opinion, I think one of the reasons is that the British were not there for such a long period, that the Patriot cause was left to go unchecked. There was no counterbalance to it. So they could do pretty much whatever they wanted to their loyalist neighbors without any fear of retaliation. So when the British finally did arrive in 1779, 1780, that gave loyalists a lot of room to vent pent-up frustration. And one act leads to another act, which leads to a counteract and whatnot. One of the documents in England's National Archives in Kew was done in 1782, in the spring of 1782, by some South Carolina loyalists in England, presenting to the king a list of people in the 96th district, which is in the interior of South Carolina, of over 300 loyalists murdered by their neighbors, not killed in battle, murdered. So, and that's just one district of South Carolina. General Nathaniel Greene, the Continental Army general in command down there at the end of the war, openly wrote that he was afraid that the South would become depopulated because of the viciousness of the war, not from the army under his command or not from the British army under the regulars' command, but from the loyalist and Whig militias against each other. So I think it was a lot of personal vendettas. Religion seemed to be more of an issue down there than up here. Economic differences, you name it. But these folks really ended up not liking each other to a very great extent.
The British never really had an army here prior to the war.
Yes, they did.
They did.
Yeah.
So what did their soldiers do? Did they just sit around and do nothing? They didn't take part in daily life, right? They didn't farm. They were just British soldiers, and
They did the bulk of the fighting. So the Americans were
prior to the war, they didn't sometimes do anything like that.
They garrisoned. They garrisoned Boston. They garrisoned parts of New Jersey. I mean, the Trenton Barracks was built for the British Army, 1759, 1760. So you had garrisons in Perth Amboy, you had garrisons in New York City before the war. Of course, Boston being the primary one. But at no time before the war, and right until the outbreak of the war, did the British Army in America consist of more than 7,000 or 8,000 people. For 13 colonies, you have about 3 million people. So that army of 8,000 may sound impressive, but I wouldn't say 8,000 troops could hold Trenton, let alone all of North America. So that's why the British hired Hessians from Germany, same as they had done in previous wars. King George III, the German king, was also the Elector of Hanover, one of the German principalities, because of course there is no united Germany. Germany is many small countries. So that's why they hire people from Hesse Kassel and Brunswick and Brandenburg, Ansbach, Anhalt, Zerbst, and all those fun places. So they just needed more people.
Okay. And Tarleton,
Mhm.
he was the guy portrayed in The Patriot.
Yes, one of the worst movies out there. Wrong on just so many levels. Apparently, there were no slaves in South Carolina. There were apparently the British put all the local people into churches and set fire to them, and hoping that one day they would be German SS troops and occupied France in 1944. So which is what actually happened, but not during the American Revolution. But yeah, I will give Roland Emmerich a little more credit than the folks in turn. At least they gave him a fictional name, not one that really was a stretch, Tappington. Whereas the folks in turn used original names, but did character assassinations on them, which their descendants were not happy about. So that's a Hollywood difference, but it's not a bad point to be made. If you're gonna you want a bad guy, and anything out of Hollywood is entertainment. All right, you need a good guy and you need a bad guy. Right, you need conflict. I get it. All right, well, yeah, no one's gonna watch everybody just swing and having a good time. That's not going to get people into the box office. So you need that conflict. And then you're going to make a bad guy, you're going to make him a really big bad guy. So hence Tarleton. If you're wondering what other movies Roland Emmerich made, if you want a real bad guy, he also created Independence Day. So, which was not about the 4th of July in 1776, but about aliens coming down to destroy the earth. So.
Here from Sarah on the chat. She says Hessians that were Prussian raised, not provincials, weren't eligible for land grants.
Actually, they were.
Okay, but her follow-up question: did some stay in America rather than returning to Prussia, Germany, maybe going out west?
If they were eligible for discharge in America, and that was only a very few, because those regiments were going back to Germany. Those were regular regiments of those principalities for the most part. They were still going to be serving in soldiers in 1784, 85, 86. That's their country's troops. But if they weren't eligible for a discharge in America, some of them did get land in Quebec or Nova Scotia, but not to a great degree. And if they were staying in America through other means, i.e. desertion, then yeah, I'm sure some of them found their ways to Pennsylvania or whatnot to settle and to create egg noodles or whatever. So, yeah.
Another question.
Two things. What was a petty sutler? You had that.
I'm sorry?
A petty sutler.
A petty sutler.
What is a petty sutler?
A petty sutler is a person who sells liquor, foods, or small goods to soldiers, officers, or soldiers. Petty sutler was generally a woman who did it to a smaller degree, whereas a sutler might have a wagon or two, a petty sutler might have a cart and sell things in that regard. Say a sewing kit. Soldiers were responsible for the mending of their own uniforms and whatnot. You might buy a sewing kit, or she may, with or without authorization, be selling rum or chocolate or tobacco, things of that nature. But generally to a smaller degree than a full-fledged sutler.
One of them. You said some of the officers were ensigns in the army. Well, ensign is a naval rank. Were there ensigns in the Navy in those days as well as in the army? No.
No, it was an army term equivalent to a second lieutenant.
Okay. So when did it stop becoming a rank in the army?
You'd have to contact a naval expert on that. And it was not just the British, it was the Americans as well. So that was the term for a second.
Because I didn't think ensign, British Navy. Ensign was never a rank in the British Navy.
So no, I've never seen it. But it was the term for a second lieutenant in the army at the time.
So Peggy Norris on the chat mentions, my Hessian ancestor deserted, bought land in Virginia, now West Virginia, then moved on to Ohio after 1800. There you go. It's an example of that.
And Peggy knows what she's talking about. She's a friend of mine from the Historical Society.
Last thing, in everything I've read, would you agree that Benedict Arnold was an excellent military man?
Yeah. Arnold was, if Arnold hadn't defected to the British, and in the manner he defected to the British, there'd be statues to him that would have been much more than his leg. All right. For those not familiar, he got wounded in the attack on Quebec on New Year's Eve, 1775-6, and was also shot there in the Second Battle of Saratoga, Bemis Heights, in October 1777. So yeah, he was, I'll give you an example. When Arnold came over to the British, he was given a general's commission, brigadier general, and also a commission as colonel to raise a provincial regiment, a regiment of Americans to serve the British. Anyone know what the name of that regiment was? I gotta see some shuddering here. Arnold's Loyalist regiment was the American Legion.
Oh,
But Arnold was almost immediately entrusted with an expedition of between 1,600 and 2,000 men to Virginia, and where he served up until June of 1781. But to read some of the British journals, particularly that of Frederick Mackenzie of the Adjutant General's Department, this was the fourth British expedition to Virginia, and Mackenzie wrote that he blushes for the conduct of some of the previous officers who had gone there compared to Arnold, because Arnold had done such great work in Virginia as opposed to the previous officers like General Matthew or General Leslie who had gone there. By great work, I mean capturing stores, burning ships, all this sort of stuff, distressing supplies for the Americans. So yeah, Arnold was, he may not have been the most respected man, certainly wasn't, but he certainly knew his way around the battlefield.
Yeah, I think that gets lost because everybody looks at him as a traitor. I mean, he was primarily responsible for Saratoga.
Yeah. Interestingly, there's a bunch of Arnold papers around, and maybe 10 years ago, I did a talk on Arnold, and I found some 1782 documents of his, which he submitted to Lord Pitt, on how to end the American war in favor of England. And it was not through military means. Arnold wanted to be the peacemaker and say how to do this politically, sort of leveraging France and Spain out of the picture. Keep in mind, the previous war, the French and Indian War, the 7 Years' War in Europe, who were the enemies of England? France and Spain, right? They were both also what? Catholic countries. America was not primarily Catholic. There was a lot of anti-papist, not Catholic, papist attitude. So saying now you're great and good allies, how they refer to them, are now France and Spain, two Catholic divine right monarchies. How does that go over? So there's all sorts of things that play with that.
Here's a question from Robert Wong. Did similarities in uniform colors ever result in friendly fire? Such as when Webb's regiment wore red uniforms compared with the British, the Newfoundland regiment wore blue uniforms like the American Continental soldiers. And he mentions that this did occur in the Civil War.
Occasionally, yes. Some of those royalist units in Canada got blue clothing in early 1778. And when they went out on scouts, when they eventually got back towards the British lines, were occasionally fired upon. And their officers were not happy about that. Also, 25 British Marines were captured at the Battle of Long Island in 1776 Now, the Battle of Long Island was one of Washington's worst defeats of the war. So out of 25 British Marines get captured. Well, they saw a battalion in a well-dressed battalion in blue in front of them and thought they were Hessians. That was their first experience with the Continental Army, and simply marched up to them saying, "Hi, we're your allies." Like, no, you're not. So, yeah, it did happen. Friendly fire incidents did happen, mostly at night. Keep in mind, the weapons were very short range. So you saw who you were shooting at. Artillery was not that long range. There's no great miles of distance between anybody. So you're seeing who you're shooting at. And you can, and there's so many cases of people recognizing each other. The cases of two brothers deliberately aiming and shooting and killing each other at the Battle of Kings Mountain. So, yeah, it gets to that degree.
Here's a comment from there. Says, my family lore is an aunt who wanted to be in the Daughters of the American Revolution, but suddenly changed her mind because apparently her family was thought to be Hessian, not DA. So, and another comment from Ian Burns. I hope I'm saying your name correctly.
He's from Williamsburg.
Okay. Regarding Arnold, there are a series of plaques in a chapel at West Point. Each one has both the name and rank of American officers from the AWI.
American War for Independence.
Okay, thank you. No, not familiar with that. Except one, which only has a rank, and that one is there for Arnold, so it doesn't have his name, but just his rank.
Okay. He's another good guy who knows what he's talking about.
So here's another comment from Robert Wong, and then if anybody else has something here. The Boot Monument at Saratoga has his left leg, but not his name. Also, the Saratoga Monument has an empty space for Gates, Morgan, etc.
Yep.
Any other questions from here? Thank you very much, Todd.